Chapter 1. The long-expected party in the quiet and peaceful land of Hobbiton. Excitement was in the air. Mr. Bilbo Baggins, the wealthy and mysterious hobbit of Bag End, had made a big announcement. He was going to celebrate his 111th birthday with a grand party, unlike any the Shire had ever seen. News of the party spread quickly, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. You see, Bilbo Baggins was no ordinary hobbit. He was famous in the Shire for many reasons. First, he was very rich. He had come back from an adventure years ago with treasure that had become the stuff of legends. Many believed that Bag End, his cozy home under the hill, was filled with tunnels packed with gold, silver, and jewels. The younger hobbits were especially eager to gossip about this treasure, even though the older folk, who remembered the stories, often shook their heads at such wild speculation. But it wasn't just Bilbo's wealth that made him the talk of the town. It was also his curious ability to stay young. Most hobbits began to show signs of aging in their later years, but not Bilbo. Even at 90, he looked just as he had at 50. By the time he reached 99, people were calling him well-preserved, although some thought the phrase unchanged was more accurate. His youthful appearance, combined with his wealth, made some hobbits uneasy. They thought it wasn't natural for someone to stay so young for so long, and some even whispered that trouble was sure to come because of it. Despite the rumors and suspicions, Bilbo was generally liked by his fellow hobbits. This was mostly because he was generous with his money. He gave freely to those in need, and even though he was odd in many ways, people were willing to overlook his peculiarities. He still maintained relationships with many of his relatives, though he had a strained relationship with the Sackville Bagginses, a distant branch of the family who had always hoped to inherit Bag End. Bilbo, however, had other plans. Among the younger generation of hobbits, Bilbo found a special friend in his cousin, Frodo Baggins. Frodo, the son of Drogo Baggins and Primula Brandybuck, had lost his parents in a tragic accident when he was just a young hobbit. Drogo and Primula had drowned in the Brandywine River, leaving Frodo an orphan. After this, Frodo was raised by his Brandybuck relatives in Buckland, far from Hobbiton. Buckland was considered a strange place by many hobbits, for it lay across the Brandywine River on the edge of the old forest, a dark and mysterious wood filled with tales of strange creatures and magic. When Bilbo turned 99, he decided to adopt Frodo as his heir and brought him to live at Bag End. This move ended any hopes the Sackville Baggins had of ever inheriting Bilbo's home and wealth. Frodo and Bilbo quickly became close. They shared a bond that went beyond their family ties. Perhaps it was because they had both experienced loss. Bilbo, the loss of his adventurous youth, and Frodo, the loss of his parents. Whatever the reason, they became inseparable. It helped that Bilbo and Frodo shared the same birthday, September 22nd. "You'd better come live with me, Frodo, my lad," Bilbo had said one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties together without any fuss." Frodo, who was still in his 20s at the time, agreed. In Hobbit terms, Frodo was still in his tweens, the years between childhood and adulthood, which for hobbits was considered to be 33. He was carefree, happy to live at Bag End, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. For 12 years, Bilbo and Frodo hosted lively birthday parties together. These events became well known in Hobbiton, for they were always full of laughter, food, and drink, with music and dancing that lasted well into the night. However, as Bilbo's 111th birthday approached, there was a sense that something even more special was about to happen. Everyone knew that Bilbo was planning something big for this birthday, something that would be remembered for years to come. After all, turning 111 was a significant milestone. It was an unusual number, and hobbits considered it quite a respectable age. Even the old Took, who had lived to the remarkable age of 130, hadn't made such a fuss about his birthdays. Frodo, too, was reaching an important age. He would be turning 33, the age at which hobbits were considered adults. It was his coming of age, and that made the upcoming party even more special. In Hobbiton and Bywater, tongues wagged as rumors of the grand event spread. The gossip ranged from discussions about Bilbo's mysterious past to wild speculations about the number of guests, the food that would be served, and whether there would be any surprises in store. Old Hamfast Gamgee, known to everyone as the Gaffer, had become one of the most popular sources of information about Bilbo. The Gaffer had worked as the gardener at Bag End for over 40 years, first under his cousin Hallman Greenhand, and then as the head gardener. He had seen Bilbo come and go, and he was always ready to share stories about the Bagginses with anyone who would listen. The Gaffer's son, Sam Gamgee, had taken over most of the garden work now, as the Gaffer's joints were stiffening with age. But both father and son were on friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo, and they lived just down the hill from Bag End in number 3, Bagshot Row. The Gaffer often held court at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, where he would tell tales of Bag End to a captive audience. "Mister, Bilbo's a fine gentleman, I've always said," the Gaffer declared, "and there's no one in the Shire as polite and well-spoken as he is. Calls me Master Hamfast, he does, and always asks my advice on the garden, especially about the growing of taters." The Gaffer was recognized as the leading expert on gardening in the neighborhood, and he took great pride in his work. But not everyone was interested in Bilbo's gardening habits. Old Noakes of Bywater leaned forward and asked, "What about this Frodo that lives with him? They say he's more than half a brandy buck, don't they?" The Gaffer nodded. Frodo's mother was a brandy buck, and his father was a Baggins. But it beats me why any hobbit from Hobbiton would go marrying in Buckland, where folks are so queer. It's no wonder they're odd, living on the wrong side of the Brandywine River, so close to the old forest. That old forest is a dark, bad place, if half the tales are true," added Daddy Two-Foot, the Gaffer's neighbor. The Gaffer agreed, though he quickly added, "Not that the Brandybucks live in the old forest, mind you, but they do fool around with boats on that big river of theirs, and that's not natural for hobbits, I say." Small wonder that trouble came of it. "Trouble indeed," muttered Old Noakes. "I heard Mr. Drogo Baggins and his wife Primula were drowned in the Brandywine after dinner one night. Some say Drogo's weight sank the boat, and others say she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after." "You shouldn't listen to all you hear," the Gaffer snapped. Boats are tricky enough without adding any pushing and pulling. The poor lad was orphaned, but Mr. Bilbo did right by him, bringing him back to live among decent folk. As the day of the party drew nearer, excitement in Hobbiton reached new heights. A strange rumor began to spread, likely started by Sam Gamgee, who had overheard Bilbo talking. The rumor was that there would be fireworks at the party, and not just any fireworks, but the finest the Shire had seen in nearly a century. Fireworks like the ones that had been set off when the old Took passed away. And then, one evening, an odd-looking wagon rolled into Hobbiton, laden with mysterious packages. It toiled its way up the hill toward Bag End, and the hobbits of Hobbiton peered out of their doors, whispering and wondering what surprises the party would hold. The tale begins with dwarves visiting Bag End, where Bilbo Baggins lives. These dwarves, with their long beards and deep hoods, came to Bag End singing strange songs. They were visiting as part of a larger plan for Bilbo's birthday, an event that was going to be celebrated in style. A few of the dwarves stayed at Bag End for a while, helping Bilbo with his preparations. Bilbo was planning something big and mysterious, but the people of Hobbiton didn't know the full details. As summer began to turn into fall, an important event occurred in mid-September. A cart rolled into Hobbiton from the direction of the Brandywine Bridge, passing through Bywater and heading toward Bag End. It wasn't an ordinary cart, and certainly not an ordinary driver. In broad daylight, an old man was seen sitting on the driver's seat, all alone. He wore a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, and a silver scarf. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. The small hobbit children, curious as ever, ran after the cart as it made its way through Hobbiton and up the hill toward Bag End. They were eager to see what the cart carried. As they had rightly guessed, it was loaded with fireworks. The old man, Gandalf the Wizard, was known for his skill with fireworks, and this was something that made the children especially excited. When he reached Bilbo's front door, Gandalf started to unload the cart. There were large bundles of fireworks of all kinds and shapes. Each bundle was labeled with a large red letter G and an elf rune, Gandalf's mark. Everyone in Hobbiton, especially the young hobbits, knew Gandalf by sight. He didn't come to the village often, but when he did, it was always a big event, mostly because of his famous fireworks displays. His reputation as a wizard, known for magic beyond fireworks, was less known among the shy folk of the Shire. For them, Gandalf was simply the man with the most amazing fireworks shows. As Gandalf unloaded the fireworks with the help of Bilbo and some dwarves, a small crowd gathered, hoping for a little display. But to their disappointment, there were no fireworks to be seen just yet. Bilbo handed out a few pennies to the onlookers, but not a single cracker or squib was set off. The children were eager for the party to start, but Gandalf simply smiled and said, "Run along now. You'll get plenty of fireworks when the time comes." With that, he and Bilbo disappeared inside, closing the door behind them. The children stayed outside for a while, staring at the door in the hope that something magical might happen. But when nothing did, they wandered away, feeling that the day of the party, the day they were so eagerly waiting for, would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf sat by the window of a small room, looking out at the garden. It was a beautiful late afternoon. The sun shone brightly, and the flowers in Bilbo's garden glowed with colors of red and gold. There were snapdragons, sunflowers, and nasturtiums trailing all over the green walls and peeking in through the round windows. "How bright your garden looks," said Gandalf, admiring the view. "Yes," replied Bilbo with a fond smile. "I'm very fond of it and of all the dear old Shire, but I think I need a holiday." Gandalf raised an eyebrow. "You mean to go on with your plan, then?" "I do," said Bilbo firmly. "I made up my mind months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well," Gandalf said thoughtfully. "It's no good saying any more. Stick to your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best, for you and for all of us." "I hope so," said Bilbo. "Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke." "Who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head with a hint of doubt. "We shall see," replied Bilbo with a mischievous smile. The preparations for Bilbo's party moved into high gear the next day. More carts began rolling up the hill, bringing all sorts of supplies. Food, drink, decorations, and special items were delivered to Bag End. The villagers were buzzing with excitement. Orders for every kind of provision, from everyday items to luxuries, started pouring out of Bag End. Hobbiton and Bywater became bustling with activity as everyone prepared for what was shaping up to be the event of the year. The people of the Shire became more and more enthusiastic. They began counting down the days on their calendars, eagerly watching for the postman, hoping to receive invitations to the grand event. Soon, invitations were being sent out in large numbers. The post offices in Hobbiton and Bywater were so overwhelmed that they had to ask for volunteers to help deliver the invitations. At the entrance to Bag End, a sign appeared: "No admittance except on party business." Even those who claimed to have party business were rarely allowed inside. Bilbo was incredibly busy writing invitations, packing presents, and making some private preparations of his own. Once Gandalf arrived, Bilbo stayed mostly out of sight, focusing on his tasks. One morning, the hobbits woke up to a surprising sight. The large field south of Bilbo's front door was covered with ropes, poles, and materials for tents and pavilions. A special entrance was cut into the hillside, leading from the road to the field. Wide steps were built, along with a large white gate. The 3 hobbit families who lived next to the field were fascinated by the preparations and couldn't help but feel a little jealous of all the attention the field was getting. Old Gaffer Gamgee, who lived nearby, stopped pretending to work in his garden just so he could watch the workers. The tents began to go up, and excitement grew even higher. There was one especially large pavilion, so big that it covered a tree that grew in the field, with the tree standing proudly near one end of the main table. Lanterns were hung from the tree's branches, adding to the festive atmosphere. Even more exciting, at least in the minds of the hobbits, was the enormous open-air kitchen that was being set up in the north corner of the field. Cooks arrived from every inn and eating house for miles around to help prepare the grand feast. The dwarves, along with other odd folk who were staying at Bag End, were also helping with the cooking and setting up for the party. However, as the day of the party approached, the weather turned cloudy, and people started to worry. The sky remained overcast on Wednesday, the day before the party. Anxiety ran high, but then, to everyone's relief, Thursday, September 22nd, dawned bright and clear. The sun rose, the clouds vanished, and the flags were unfurled. The party had officially begun. Bilbo called it a party, but it was really more like several entertainments rolled into one big celebration. Practically everyone who lived nearby was invited, and even people from farther away in the Shire, and some from beyond, were asked to attend. A few guests were accidentally overlooked, but they showed up anyway, so it didn't really matter. Bilbo met all of his guests personally at the new White Gate. As was Hobbit custom on birthdays, Bilbo gave away presents to everyone who arrived. Some guests even snuck out and came back in again just to get a second present. In the Shire, hobbits always give presents on their birthdays, though they're usually small, everyday items. But Bilbo was feeling extra generous, and the gifts he gave out were unusually good. The Hobbit children were so excited by the presents that they almost forgot about eating, a rare thing for hobbits. The toys and trinkets Bilbo gave out were like nothing the children had ever seen before. Many of the gifts were magical, and some had been specially ordered from faraway places, made by the dwarves in the mountains and the skilled craftsmen of Dale. Once all the guests were inside the gate, the real fun began. There were songs, dances, music, games, and, of course, food and drink in abundance. The party had 3 main meals: lunch, tea, and dinner or supper. Everyone sat down together for those meals, but at all other times, there was a constant stream of hobbits eating and drinking from mid-morning until late into the evening. The highlight of the party was, without a doubt, the fireworks. These weren't just any fireworks. They were crafted and designed by Gandalf himself. The show began at 6:30 sharp, and Gandalf personally set off the special effects. The fireworks included squibs, crackers, sparklers, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. The crowd was amazed by the spectacle. Gandalf's fireworks were the best anyone had ever seen. There were rockets that looked like flocks of birds singing sweet songs, and smoke trees that opened like flowers, with glowing leaves falling gently onto the astonished hobbits. There were butterflies made of light and pillars of fire that turned into eagles, ships, or swans. There was even a thunderstorm of red fire, followed by a shower of golden rain. The grand finale, however, was the most exciting part. A huge cloud of smoke rose up and shaped itself into a mountain. Flames shot out of the mountain's peak, and suddenly a red and gold dragon appeared, flying out over the crowd. It wasn't life-sized, but it was terrifyingly realistic. Fire spewed from its jaws, and its eyes glowed fiercely as it roared. The dragon flew 3 times over the heads of the guests, causing everyone to duck or fall flat on their faces. It then zoomed over the nearby bywater, where it burst into a spectacular explosion. "That's the signal for supper," Bilbo announced cheerfully. Everyone quickly forgot their fear and rushed to their feet, eager to enjoy the next part of the celebration. Bilbo Baggins was known for his love of good food, fine drinks, and celebrations. But no one in the Shire had seen anything quite like the party he had thrown for his 111th birthday. It was a grand occasion, not just because of the milestone age, though it was rare enough for hobbits to reach such a number, but because Bilbo had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that his guests would remember this event for years to come. The feast alone was a sight to behold. The tables were set up in the large green fields surrounding Bag End, under an array of brightly colored lanterns that cast a warm glow over the gathering. The hobbits, being creatures of great appetite, were immediately drawn to the long banquet tables, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, cheeses, pies, cakes, and fruits of every kind. The ale and wine flowed freely, and the clinking of glasses, the laughter, and the chatter of happy hobbits filled the air. People came from all over the Shire and beyond. Not only were the local hobbits of Hobbiton present, such as the Bagginses, Tooks, and Brandybucks, but also families from neighboring regions, the Grubbs, Chubbs, Hornblowers, and Bracegirdles. Even the often aloof Sackville Bagginses showed up, though they spent most of their time muttering amongst themselves and giving Bilbo suspicious looks. It was clear to all that Bilbo had spared no expense. His generous catering depleted the stock of nearly every grocer, cellar, and warehouse within 100 miles, but no one seemed to care much about that at the moment. The guests were far too engrossed in the abundance before them. As the evening wore on and the hobbits reached that pleasant state they called filling up the corners, meaning they were just about full but could still manage a bit more food and drink, Bilbo decided it was time to make his speech. The hobbits, now sipping their favorite drinks, whether ales, ciders, or something a bit stronger, were in a mellow mood, their bellies full, and their cares forgotten. They cheered at every pause in conversation and were prepared to listen to anything that might come next. "Attention, my dear people," Bilbo said, rising from his seat at the head of the table. The cheers grew louder. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, echoing each other, their excitement bubbling over. For a moment, it seemed like no one was actually listening, too caught up in the merriment. But Bilbo, not to be deterred, left his seat and climbed onto a chair so that everyone could see him clearly. The lanterns hanging from the tree nearby cast a golden glow on his face, and the light reflected off the shiny buttons of his embroidered silk waistcoat. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," Bilbo began, waving his hand in the air, "and my dear Tooks, Brandybucks, Grubbs, Chubbs, Broses, Hornblowers, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Goodbodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proud feet," shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. It was old Odo Proudfoot, his large, exceptionally hairy feet propped up on the table in front of him. Bilbo grinned. "Proud feet," he repeated with a nod. "And let me not forget my good Sackville Bagginses, who I am happy to see have graced us with their presence at long last." At this, the Sackville Bagginses exchanged frosty looks, still clearly unhappy about something, but the rest of the crowd erupted into more cheers and clapping. Bilbo continued, his face beaming with the glow of a hobbit who knew he had an audience in the palm of his hand. "Today," he said with pride, "is my 111th birthday. I am 111 today." The crowd burst into applause, their cheers mixing with the sounds of trumpets, horns, and flutes from the younger hobbits, who had clearly had too much to drink by this point. Hooray! Hooray! Many happy returns, they shouted, banging their mugs on the tables. It was just the kind of thing they loved to hear, short, simple, and to the point. Bilbo smiled warmly, looking out at the sea of happy, familiar faces before him. "I hope you are all enjoying yourselves as much as I am," he continued, and again the crowd erupted in cheers and more noise from the musical instruments. Many of the younger hobbits had begun pulling musical crackers, colorful, noisy little things with instruments hidden inside, small but perfectly made. Some had started an impromptu orchestra in one corner of the field, and the tune they played was lively and merry. It was, by all accounts, a perfect hobbit party. Everard took and Melilot Brandybuck, feeling bold after several mugs of ale, climbed onto a table and began to dance the Springle Ring, a lively and energetic hobbit dance. The sight of them, bells jingling in their hands, brought more laughter from the crowd. But Bilbo hadn't finished speaking. He grabbed a horn from a nearby youngster and blew 3 loud blasts, calling for silence. Slowly, the noise subsided, and the guests turned their attention back to him. "I shall not keep you long," he said, though his twinkling eyes suggested otherwise. The crowd cheered again, more out of habit than understanding. "I have called you all together for a purpose." At this, the mood of the crowd shifted slightly. There was something in Bilbo's tone that gave his words more weight than before. A few of the hobbits stopped chewing on their food and pricked up their ears. Even the Sackville Bagginses, who had been grumbling quietly to each other for most of the evening, fell silent. "For 3 purposes, in fact," Bilbo continued, holding up 3 fingers. "First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 111 years is far too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits." This was met with thunderous applause. The hobbits loved to be told they were admirable, and Bilbo's words sent a wave of approval rippling through the crowd. He let them enjoy the moment before raising his hand again for quiet. "Secondly," he said, "to celebrate my birthday." Another round of cheers erupted, but Bilbo raised his voice to continue. "I should say our birthday, for it is also the birthday of my heir and nephew, Frodo." He gestured toward Frodo, who was seated nearby, looking a little overwhelmed by all the attention. "He comes of age today and into his inheritance." There was more clapping, though this time it was a bit more scattered. The younger hobbits, ever fond of Frodo, shouted his name enthusiastically, while the older ones gave a polite round of applause. But the Sackville Bagginses, looking displeased again, exchanged dark glances, clearly wondering what Bilbo meant by inheritance. "Together, we score 144, Bilbo continued. "Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total. 1 gross, if I may use the expression." This didn't go over quite as well. The mention of 1 gross didn't sit right with many of the guests, especially the Sackville Bagginses, who looked particularly insulted. They felt as if they'd been invited just to make up the numbers, like items to fill a package. There were a few scattered mutterings, but Bilbo pressed on. "And thirdly," Bilbo said, pausing dramatically. "I wish to make an announcement." The crowd, sensing something important was coming, fell completely silent. Even the younger Tooks, who had been half-heartedly playing their instruments, stopped and looked toward Bilbo with wide eyes. "I regret to announce," Bilbo said, his voice louder now, "that though, as I said, 111 years is far too short a time to spend among you, this is the end. I am going. I am leaving now." For a moment, there was stunned silence. The hobbits blinked in confusion, unsure of what they had just heard. Then, before anyone could react, Bilbo stepped down from the chair, and with a blinding flash of light, he disappeared. There was a collective gasp from the crowd. Hobbits all around the pavilion rubbed their eyes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Bilbo was gone, vanished, disappeared into thin air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, old Odo Proudfoot, who had finally removed his feet from the table, stood up and stomped on the ground, breaking the silence. This seemed to snap the rest of the guests out of their shock, and soon everyone was talking at once. "Was it a joke?" one hobbit asked. "He's mad," another declared, shaking his head. "I always said so." Most of the guests seemed to agree that Bilbo's disappearance was some sort of prank, though a few, like old Rory Brandybuck, weren't so sure. Rory, always sharp despite his age and the enormous meal he had just consumed, leaned over to his daughter-in-law, Esmeralda. "There's something fishy about this, my dear," he said in a low voice. "I believe that Mad Baggins is off again." Meanwhile, Frodo sat quietly in his seat, staring at the empty chair where Bilbo had been just moments before. He had known about the plan. Of course, Bilbo had told him in advance, but even so, he found himself feeling deeply troubled. As much as he had enjoyed watching the surprised faces of the guests, there was a heaviness in his heart. He suddenly realized how much he loved the old hobbit, and the thought of Bilbo leaving for good weighed on him more than he had expected. The rest of the guests, however, were more concerned with resuming the party. "Send the wine around again," someone shouted, and the merriment resumed, though with a slightly more subdued air than before. The Sackville Bagginses, clearly offended by the entire evening, had already stormed off in a huff. As for Bilbo, he had indeed left. Even as he made his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, the same magical ring he had kept secret for so many years. As he stepped down from the chair, he had slipped the ring onto his finger, rendering himself invisible. He walked quickly away from the pavilion, leaving the confused and chattering guests behind him. Bilbo made his way back to Bag End with a brisk pace, smiling to himself as he listened to the sounds of the party fading into the distance. Inside his home, he wasted no time. He took off his fine party clothes, carefully folding his embroidered waistcoat and setting it aside. He then dressed in his old traveling garments, worn and patched from years of use. From a locked drawer, he retrieved an old cloak and hood, items he had not worn in many years. Though faded and weather-stained, they had been dear to him, and now they would accompany him on one final adventure. Bilbo moved through his home with purpose, collecting a few last items: a small sword in a battered leather scabbard, a bundle of belongings wrapped in cloth, and a large envelope containing the golden ring, which he addressed to Frodo. At first, he placed the envelope on the mantelpiece, but something made him pause. After a moment's hesitation, he tucked it into his pocket instead. Just then, the door creaked open, and Gandalf entered the room. The old wizard had been watching from a distance, keeping an eye on Bilbo's plans. "Ah, Gandalf," Bilbo said, smiling as he saw his old friend. "I wondered if you would turn up." "I'm glad to find you still visible," Gandalf replied, settling into a chair. "I wanted to have a few final words with you before you disappear for good." Bilbo chuckled. "It all went splendidly, don't you think?" he said, though his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Except for that flash startled me, that did." Gandalf raised an eyebrow. "That was my little addition," he said. "You've kept that ring secret all these years, and it seemed to me that your sudden disappearance needed a bit of extra flair. You are an interfering old busybody." Bilbo laughed, though there was affection in his voice. "But I suppose you know best, as usual." Gandalf nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. "I hope so," he said. "But I'm not entirely sure about this plan of yours. Are you certain you're ready to go?" Bilbo's smile faded slightly, and for the first time that evening, he looked a little tired. "Yes, I am," he said quietly. "I feel stretched, Gandalf, like butter scraped over too much bread. I need a holiday, a very long holiday. And I don't expect I shall return." Gandalf studied him closely for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if that's your decision, then I won't stop you," he said softly. "But take care, my old friend. The road ahead may be longer than you think." "I've made all the arrangements," Bilbo said with a final nod. "It's time to go." With that, Bilbo Baggins, the most peculiar hobbit the Shire had ever known, set off on his journey, leaving behind his home, his friends, and his old life. And though many in the Shire would talk of his disappearance for years to come, no one would ever quite understand the true reason why Bilbo had left. For Frodo, as he sat quietly in the now empty pavilion, watching the last of the party guests wander home, he knew that his life, too, was about to change. What he didn't yet realize was that the same golden ring that had helped Bilbo slip away unnoticed would soon bring him on a much greater adventure, one far more dangerous and far-reaching than anything his uncle had ever imagined. Bilbo Baggins, standing in his cozy hobbit hole of Bag End, spoke quietly but with a sense of longing in his voice. "I want to see the mountains again, Gandalf," he said, glancing over at the wizard sitting nearby. His gaze drifted to the window, where the Shire lay peaceful and untouched outside, the place he had called home for so many years. "Mountains, and then find somewhere where I can rest in peace, away from all the noise and visitors, without any relatives snooping around or people ringing the bell." He sighed, thinking of the simplicity he craved now, far from the adventures of his youth. "Maybe, in a quiet place, I could finish my book. I've even thought of the perfect ending for it." And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. Gandalf chuckled softly, his deep voice filling the room. "I hope you do live happily to the end of your days, Bilbo." He paused and added more thoughtfully, "Though I wonder if anyone will read that book, however it ends." "Oh, they might," Bilbo replied with a small smile. "One day, years from now. Frodo has already read some of it, as far as I've written." His eyes softened as he mentioned his younger cousin. "You'll keep an eye on Frodo, won't you, Gandalf?" "Yes, I will," Gandalf promised. "I'll keep 2 eyes on him as often as I can spare them." Bilbo nodded, reassured. He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to join me once, just before the party. But deep down, I know he's not ready yet. He's still very much in love with the Shire, with its woods, fields, and little rivers. He's comfortable here, and that's where he belongs for now. Bilbo's voice became wistful. "But me? I want to see the wild country again before I die. I'm leaving everything to Frodo, of course. He's grown, and it's time for him to be his own master. I hope he'll be happy here once he gets used to being on his own." Gandalf looked at him seriously. "Everything, Bilbo? Including the ring?" Bilbo hesitated for a moment, his hand unconsciously slipping into his pocket. "Yes, yes, the ring as well." His voice wavered slightly as he continued. "You remember our agreement, don't you?" "I remember," Gandalf said, watching him closely. Bilbo, feeling uneasy, suddenly blurted out, "It's in an envelope, if you must know. There on the mantelpiece." He pointed toward the fireplace, but then stopped short, his fingers brushing against something in his pocket. "Well, no, here it is in my pocket." He chuckled nervously, surprised at his own forgetfulness. "Isn't that odd?" For a brief moment, Bilbo's smile faded. He turned the ring over in his fingers, almost talking to himself. "After all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay here with me?" Gandalf's eyes narrowed slightly, and a deep, knowing look came over his face. "Bilbo," he said quietly but firmly, "I think you should leave it behind. Don't you want to?" "Well, yes and no." Bilbo's voice wavered again, caught between two powerful feelings. "Now that it comes to it, I don't like the idea of parting with it. Not at all, if I'm honest. And I don't see why I should. Why do you keep insisting that I give it up?" Gandalf remained calm, but his gaze never wavered. "I think you know why, Bilbo. It's for your own good." Bilbo's expression changed, suspicion creeping into his voice. "You're always badgering me about my ring," he said sharply, a touch of anger now behind his words. "But you never bothered me about all the other things I brought back from my adventures. What makes this ring so special?" Gandalf's voice grew serious. "I had to badger you about this one, Bilbo. It's important. Magic rings are, well, magical, and they're rare and curious. I was interested in yours from the start, and I still am. But more than that, I think you've had it long enough. You don't need it anymore." Bilbo's face flushed with anger. His kindly features hardened, and his voice rose. "Why not? What business is it of yours, anyway, what I do with my own things? It's mine. I found it. It came to me." Gandalf held up a hand, his expression calm. "Yes, yes, it is yours. but there's no need to get upset. If I'm angry, it's because of you, Bilbo shouted. It's mine, I tell you, my own, my precious. Gandalf's face remained still, but something flickered in his deep, watchful eyes. He was both startled and alarmed by Bilbo's sudden change in tone. It has been called that before, the wizard said softly, but not by you. Bilbo's eyes darted back and forth, his breathing quickening. I say it now, and why not? Even if Gollum once called it precious, it's not his anymore. It's mine, and I shall keep it. Gandalf stood up suddenly, his voice turning stern and commanding. You would be a fool if you did, Bilbo. You're making that clearer with every word you speak. The ring has too much of a hold on you already. Let it go, and then you'll be free. Bilbo, still clutching the ring in his hand, glared at Gandalf defiantly. I'll do as I choose and go where I please. The room grew tense as Gandalf's expression darkened. Now, my dear hobbit, he said, his voice softer but still serious. We have been friends for a long time, and you owe me something for that. Come, do as you promised. Give up the ring. Bilbo's anger flared again. If you want the ring for yourself, just say so, he cried, his hand straying to the hilt of his small sword. But you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you. Gandalf's eyes flashed with a sudden fire. It will be my turn to get angry soon if you say that again, he warned, his voice booming with power. The wizard took a step toward Bilbo, and in that moment he seemed to grow taller, more menacing. His shadow filled the room, casting a dark, looming presence over the small hobbit. Bilbo backed away, his hand still clutching the ring tightly. His heart raced as the tension in the room grew unbearable. For a moment, it seemed as if the air itself was crackling with energy. But then Gandalf's expression softened, and the tension began to ease. I am not trying to rob you, Bilbo, the wizard said, his voice calm once more. I am trying to help you. I wish you would trust me as you used to. Bilbo stood there, trembling, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He looked at the ring in his hand, then back at Gandalf, his old friend who had been with him through so much. Slowly, his grip on the ring relaxed. I don't know what's come over me, Bilbo said, his voice shaky. You've never been like this before, Gandalf. What is it all about? It's the ring, Bilbo, Gandalf replied. It's got too strong a hold on you. You must leave it behind. Bilbo hesitated, then nodded, a look of sadness in his eyes. I suppose you're right. It's been growing on my mind lately, always tempting me to put it on, to disappear. I've tried locking it up, but I could never rest without it in my pocket. It's like an eye, always watching me. Gandalf nodded gravely. Then trust my judgment, Bilbo. Leave the ring behind and go in peace. Bilbo sighed deeply, the weight of the ring still heavy in his hand. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I will. With an effort, he shrugged his shoulders and smiled, though it was a tired smile. After all, that's what this party was for, wasn't it? To give away everything, including the ring. With that, Bilbo placed the ring on the mantelpiece, feeling the strange sense of relief as he let it go. He picked up his bag, took one last look around the room, and headed for the door. Gandalf followed him to the entrance, watching as Bilbo stepped out into the cool night air. "It's a fine night for a journey," Bilbo said, looking up at the stars. "What fun it will be to be off on the road again with dwarves for company." Gandalf smiled warmly. "Goodbye, Bilbo. Take care of yourself." Bilbo waved cheerfully, his spirits lifting as he stepped out into the night. "Goodbye, Gandalf. I'm as happy as Frodo stood on the steps of Bag End, feeling a heavy weight on his heart as he prepared to say goodbye to the many guests who had gathered for Bilbo's birthday celebration. It was a painful duty, one he had anticipated, but still found difficult to face. Whispers and rumors of strange happenings had already spread across the Shire, creating an air of uncertainty and curiosity among the guests. Frodo, however, remained calm and assured. "No doubt everything will be cleared up in the morning," he told himself, hoping that by then all the confusion would be resolved. As the clock struck midnight, carriages began to arrive for the important guests. One by one, they rolled away, filled with hobbits who were well fed but left feeling very unsatisfied. The party had been a grand affair, but now the mood was shifting. A group of gardeners had come by arrangement to collect those guests who had inadvertently remained behind. They pushed wheelbarrows through the garden, gathering the last of the revelers as the night slowly passed. With the dawn, the sun rose over the Shire, illuminating the paths and gardens of Hobbiton. The hobbits woke up later than usual, their celebrations having stretched well into the night. As the morning continued, a bustling atmosphere filled Bag End and its surroundings. People began to clear away the remnants of the party, the pavilions, tables, chairs, spoons, knives, bottles, plates, lanterns, flowering shrubs in boxes, and the scattered crumbs of food that remained from the lavish feast. Forgotten bags, gloves, handkerchiefs, and bits of uneaten food were also gathered up, ensuring nothing would be left behind. By midday, a large crowd of hobbits, many of whom were uninvited but not unexpected, had gathered around Bag End. They had heard of the aftermath of the party and were curious about what treasures might still be available. Frodo, standing at the entrance, smiled warmly at the approaching guests, but looked tired and somewhat worried. He welcomed everyone with a cheerful nod, but his words were few. His constant reply to their inquiries was simple and unwavering. "Mr. Bilbo Baggins has gone away, as far as I know, for good." Among the guests were some whom Bilbo had invited to come inside, as he had left messages for them before his departure. Inside the cozy hall, there was a large assortment of packages, parcels, and small pieces of furniture piled high. Each item had a label attached, identifying its intended recipient. For instance, there were several labels addressed to Adelard Took, attached to a fine umbrella that he had carried off during the festivities. Next to that, Frodo noticed a large waste-paper basket labeled "For Dora Baggins," in memory of a long correspondence with love from Bilbo. Dora was the sister of Drogo Baggins and was the oldest surviving female relative of both Bilbo and Frodo. At 99 years old, She had penned countless letters filled with advice and wisdom over the years. Another label read, "For Milo Burrows, hoping it will be useful, from BB," attached to a gold pen and ink bottle. Milo, a close friend, had never been good at replying to letters, which was likely why Bilbo had chosen to gift him something that would encourage a response. There was also a round convex mirror labeled "For Angelica's use," from Uncle Bilbo. Angelica was a young Baggins who took great pride in her looks. Bilbo knew she would appreciate the gift. A case of silver spoons labeled "For Lobelia Sackville Baggins," from Bilbo, had been set aside, as Bilbo suspected she had borrowed many of his spoons during his travels. This assortment was just a small sample of the many gifts collected over the years. Bilbo's home had become cluttered with items he had received throughout his long life. This was a common occurrence among hobbits, who tended to accumulate many birthday presents. Though not all the gifts were new, Bilbo typically gifted new items and kept the old ones he received. The hall was now being cleared of some of this clutter, making room for Frodo to breathe. Each of the various parting gifts bore labels written personally by Bilbo, and many included a point or a joke that only the recipient would understand. Most of the gifts were given to those who would appreciate and welcome them. The less fortunate hobbits, especially those living on Bagshot Row, benefited greatly from this generosity. Old Gaffer Gamgee received 2 sacks of potatoes, a new spade, a woolen waistcoat, and a bottle of ointment for his creaking joints. Old Rory Brandybuck, in return for his hospitality, received a dozen bottles of old wine, a strong red from the South Farthing. This wine had matured well during Bilbo's long absence. After a sip of the first bottle, Rory was so pleased that he forgave Bilbo for leaving and declared him a capital fellow. Frodo also found that he had many treasures left, including books, pictures, and plenty of furniture. However, there was no sign of money or jewelry. Not a single penny or piece of glassware had been given away. Frodo had a challenging afternoon ahead of him. A false rumor spread quickly, claiming that the entire household was being given away for free. Before long, the place was filled with people who had no business being there. The situation became chaotic. Labels were torn off items, and arguments broke out among the guests. Some people attempted to swap items, while others tried to take things that were not addressed to them, seizing anything that seemed unwanted or unattended. The road to the gate was blocked with barrows and hand carts, making it difficult for Frodo to navigate through the crowd. In the middle of the commotion, the Sackville Bagginses arrived. Frodo had taken a short break and left his friend Merry Brandybuck in charge to monitor the chaos. When Otho Sackville Baggins loudly demanded to see Frodo, Merry, always polite, responded, "He's indisposed." Otho, however, insisted, saying, "Hiding, you mean? We want to see him, and we will see him." Merry reluctantly left them waiting in the hall, while Frodo took a moment for himself. During this time, they discovered their parting gift of spoons, which did little to improve their already foul tempers. Eventually, they were shown into Frodo's study. Frodo was seated at a table covered with papers, appearing somewhat reluctant to engage with the Sackville Bagginses. He stood up, fidgeting with something in his pocket, but greeted them politely. The Sackville Bagginses wasted no time. They began by offering Frodo lowball prices for various valuable but unlabeled items they had their eyes on. When Frodo firmly replied that only the items specifically directed by Bilbo were being given away, Otho sneered. "This whole affair is very fishy. One thing is clear. You are doing exceedingly well out of it." He insisted on seeing Bilbo's will, claiming he would have been Bilbo's heir if not for Frodo's adoption. Frodo handed over the will, and Otho read it carefully, snorting in frustration. The will was quite clear and correct according to the legal customs of hobbits, which required 7 signatures of witnesses in red ink. "Foiled again," he exclaimed, turning to his wife. After waiting 60 years, all he had to show for it was a set of spoons. He snapped his fingers under Frodo's nose in annoyance and stormed off. Lobelia, however, was not easily deterred. A little while later, Frodo came out of the study to see how things were going and found her still wandering around the house, poking into every nook and cranny. He politely escorted her off the property, but not before retrieving several small but valuable articles that had somehow found their way into her umbrella. As Lobelia stepped outside, she turned around on the step, her face contorted in indignation. "You'll live to regret this, young fellow. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins, you're a Brandybuck." Mary, overhearing the remark, said, "That was an insult, if you like." Frodo replied, "It was a compliment," and shut the door on her. After dealing with Lobelia, Frodo and Mary went around the house to check for any more trouble. They found 3 young hobbits, 2 buffins, and a Bolger, who were busy knocking holes in the walls of one of the cellars. Frodo had to shoo them away, reminding them that they weren't supposed to be there. Next, Frodo had a tussle with young Sancho Proudfoot, the grandson of old Odo Proudfoot. Sancho had started excavating in the pantry, thinking he heard an echo. The legend of Bilbo's hidden gold excited both curiosity and hope. As Frodo pushed Sancho out, he collapsed into a chair in the hall, feeling utterly worn out. "Oh, it's time to close the shop, Mary," Frodo said. "Lock the door and don't open it to anyone today, not even if they bring a battering ram." With that, he decided to revive himself with a cup of tea. Just as he settled down with his tea, there came a soft knock at the front door. "Oh, it's Lobelia again, most likely," Frodo thought. He figured she must have thought of something nasty to say. "Don't answer it," he said, thinking he could ignore her. But then, just as he picked up his cup, he heard a familiar voice say, "Frodo!" It was Gandalf's voice, and Frodo felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Open the door, you fool! If you don't let me in, I'll blow the door down." Frodo sprang up, flinging the door wide open. There stood Gandalf, tall and imposing, his white hair shining like silver. "You're late," Frodo exclaimed, joyfully inviting the wizard inside. "What's going on? I thought I'd have to deal with Lobelia all day." Gandalf stepped inside, a twinkle in his eye. "I heard what happened," he said. "Lobelia has been causing quite a scene. You need to be careful, Frodo. I hope you haven't been too generous with Bilbo's ring." Frodo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he replied. but I had to give them something." Gandalf leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The ring has more to it than just making you disappear. You will learn more as time goes on. For now, just remember to keep it secret. Keep it safe." Frodo nodded, trying to absorb the weight of Gandalf's words. "I will, I promise. But I feel so lost right now." Gandalf smiled gently. "It's normal to feel overwhelmed, especially with the chaos surrounding you. Just take things one day at a time. You have your friends and family to help you." With that, Gandalf bade Frodo farewell. "I must be off, but I will return soon. Keep an eye on your belongings, Frodo, and stay away from trouble." As Frodo watched Gandalf leave, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. Perhaps with time and the support of his friends, he could navigate this new chapter of his life. And as he locked the door behind the wizard, he felt a renewed sense of hope, determined to find a way through the confusion that had taken hold of his home.